The morning they decided to get rid of me, my stepmother was humming. That detail stays with me even now. The soft, almost cheerful sound drifting through the corridor outside my door, as casual as birdsong, as though what was being arranged inside that drawing room was nothing more significant than a change of table linens. I heard my father's voice too, low and measured, the way it always was when he had already made up his mind and simply needed to say the words aloud to make them official. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall of my room and listened without meaning to. She will go in Seraphine's place. 5 words. That was all it took to rewrite my entire existence. My name is Kate. I am 23 years old, the daughter of Lord Harwell of the Ashfield territory, though daughter has always been a word used loosely in our household, tethered to me by blood alone and nothing else. My mother passed when I was 4. I remember almost nothing of her except a scent, something like crushed lavender and warm bread, and the impression of golden hair catching afternoon light. I inherited that hair, pale, almost silver blonde, the kind that draws attention in a crowd whether you want it to or not. My stepmother, Celeste, called it garish. My stepsister Seraphine called it sad, which was crueler somehow, because she said it with a smile. Seraphine was the one who was supposed to go to Varenhold. Every pack in the 7 territories knew what the summons meant. Once every generation, the Alpha King selected an emissary from each noble house, a representative. They called it officially, though everyone whispered the real word behind closed doors: tribute. The chosen one would travel to Varenhold, the seat of the Alpha King's power, and serve in his court for an undetermined period. Some came back within a year, some never came back at all. Not because anything terrible had happened to them, simply because Varenhold became their world, and the lives they had left behind shrank to the size of something they no longer fit into. Seraphine had been prepared for this for months. New dresses, lessons in court etiquette, a carefully rehearsed way of lowering her gaze that was meant to convey humility while still showing off her cheekbones. Then, 3 days before departure, she announced she was in love, with a stable hand named Corvin, no less. A perfectly decent young man, by all accounts, with kind eyes and no political value whatsoever. Seraphine had wept with the theatrical devastation that only she could manage, and Celeste, who loved her daughter with the particular ferocity of a woman who had never been loved enough herself, had gone to my father and said simply, "Find another way." My father, who had not looked directly at me in approximately 4 years, found the other way without much difficulty. I stood in the corridor listening to the arrangement being finalized, and I noticed, with a strange detachment, that no one came to ask me. No one knocked on my door. No one sat across from me with even the pretense of offering a choice. My father emerged from the drawing room 20 minutes later, handed me a folded document with the royal seal already pressed into the wax, and said, "You leave Thursday. Try not to embarrass us." That was the whole conversation. Thursday arrived gray and damp, the sky the color of old pewter, mist rolling in from the valley below Ashfield in slow, deliberate waves. I stood at the front gate with a single trunk. They had not given me time, or perhaps resources, for more, and breathed in the smell of wet earth and pine resin, and the faint smoke from the kitchen fires. I tried to memorize it, not out of sentimentality, but out of something more practical. I wanted to remember exactly what I was leaving, so I could not romanticize it later. The carriage that came for me was not the Harwell carriage. It bore the royal mark, a black wolf's head on a field of deep burgundy, and the driver did not speak to me at all. He simply loaded my trunk with efficient indifference and gestured toward the door. Celeste did not come outside. My father stood on the steps, hands clasped behind his back, his expression arranged into something that could pass for dignified stoicism if you didn't look too closely at the relief underneath it. Seraphine watched from an upstairs window. I could see the pale oval of her face behind the glass, and I thought, for just a moment, that she might wave. She didn't. She stepped back from the curtain and disappeared. I got into the carriage alone. The journey to Varenhold took 3 days through increasingly wild country. The flat, cultivated fields of Ashfield giving way to dense forest, then to the high granite passes of the Keldmore Range, then finally to the valley where Varenhold sat like something that had grown out of the rock rather than been built upon it. I had heard it described. Everyone had heard it described. No description was adequate. The fortress was vast and dark and somehow alive-looking, its towers rising against the sky with the kind of arrogant permanence that only centuries could produce. Torchlight moved along the outer walls, even in daylight. Guards, I realized, constant and unblinking. The forest pressed close on all sides, ancient trees with roots like grasping hands, the canopy so thick that it turned afternoon light green and strange. Everything smelled of pine and cold stone, and something underneath both. Something I could not name, sharp and electric, like the air before a storm breaks. I pressed my palm flat against my sternum and told myself to breathe. The carriage passed through the outer gate, then the inner gate, then crossed a stone bridge over a river that ran black with depth, and stopped in a courtyard where several people were already waiting. Not servants. They stood too still for servants, too watchful. Warriors, I understood. The Alpha King's inner guard, dressed in dark leather and furs, each one radiating the contained power that marked a shifter who had never once in their life been made to feel small. I stepped out of the carriage and immediately understood what it meant to be the wrong kind of conspicuous. Every eye in that courtyard found me. Not with hostility, not yet, but with the particular quality of attention that predators give to something unexpected. I was too pale, too slight, too obviously human in bearing even if my blood carried what it carried. My blonde braid hung over one shoulder. My gray cloak was plain. I had nothing to recommend me except the document in my hand, and the fact that I had not yet looked away from any of them. A woman broke from the group. Tall, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and the bearing of someone who had given orders her entire life and found the experience agreeable. She stopped 2 feet from me and looked me over with the frank assessment of someone evaluating a map for accuracy. "You're the Harwell emissary?" she said. "Kate Harwell," I said. "Yes." She did not introduce herself immediately. That, I would learn later, was characteristic. Her name was Soren, captain of the King's Interior Guard, which meant she controlled who moved through the inner fortress and how, and had for 11 years. She looked at me for another long moment, and then something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not softness exactly, but recalibration. "Come," she said. "He wants to see you tonight." My stomach dropped. Tonight. The emissaries from the other territories hadn't arrived yet. I could tell from the relative quiet of the courtyard, the absence of the kind of organized chaos that multiple delegations would produce. Already? He was informed of the substitution, Soren said, already moving toward the main doors. He has questions. She said it simply, without warning or reassurance, as though the Alpha King has questions about you specifically was a perfectly ordinary thing to drop into a sentence and walk away from. I followed her into Varenhold, and the great doors closed behind me with a sound like the whole world rearranging itself. The entrance hall was immense. Stone floors worn smooth by generations of boots, walls hung with maps rather than tapestries, the kind of practical grandeur that valued information over decoration. Sconces lined the walls, casting everything in amber and shadow. Other people moved through the space with purposeful quiet. Scribes carrying rolls of parchment, guards rotating at doorways, a young man with red hair and a satchel who glanced at me with open curiosity, before someone older and more severe directed him away with a look. I catalogued everything. It was a habit. Had been since childhood, this compulsive observation, this need to understand a room before a room could define me. I noticed the worn center of each staircase step, the way the maps were annotated in at least 3 different hands, the fact that every guard I could see was alert, but not tense. a place that felt dangerous, but not afraid of itself. Soren led me up 2 flights of stairs and stopped before a door that was unremarkable except for its thickness. Oak reinforced with iron, the kind of door built to contain sound as much as to control entry. "One thing," she said, and she turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Don't apologize for being here. He dislikes it." Then she knocked twice and opened the door without waiting for a response. The room beyond was a study, maps everywhere, as expected, spilling across a wide desk and pinned to a standing board along one wall. Bookshelves rising to the ceiling. A window looking out over the dark valley below, the forest stretching away into the distance like a held breath. And at the center of it, with his back to me, looking out that window with the stillness of a man who had never in his life been startled, Draven, Alpha King of Varenhold, ruler of the 7 territories, turned around. He was not what I had imagined. I had imagined something brutal, obvious in its power. What I saw instead was a man who wore his authority the way the mountains wore weather, not performed, simply present. Dark braids, ice blue eyes that found me immediately and stayed, broad shoulders beneath black leather, a scar crossing his jaw that looked old enough to have its own history. He looked at me the way Soren had, assessing, direct, but with something underneath it that her gaze hadn't carried. Surprise, maybe. Or its quieter cousin, recognition. "You are not Seraphine Harwell," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind that didn't need volume to fill a room. "No," I said. "I'm the one they didn't want." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite anything nameable. And Draven, Alpha King, said, "Sit down, Kate Harwell. We have a great deal to discuss. I did not sleep well that first night. My room was in the east wing of the fortress, not the servants' quarters, which surprised me, but not the guest chambers reserved for visiting dignitaries either. Something in between. A room with a real bed, a window that looked over the inner courtyard, a writing desk, and a fireplace that someone had already lit before my arrival. The fire had burned down to embers by the time Soren showed me to the door, and I spent an hour feeding it back to life with the careful, methodical attention of someone who needed something to do with their hands. The conversation with Draven had lasted 40 minutes. He had asked me questions, not the ceremonial kind, not the "how was your journey? What are your father's intentions?" kind of questions that court protocol demanded. He had asked me what I knew about the border disputes in the Northern Territories. He had asked me what I thought of the Ashfield Pact's handling of the last drought allocation. He had asked me, almost as an aside, whether I had ever been to the Keldmore Passes before. I had answered all of it honestly, because I was too tired from 3 days of travel to be strategic, and because something in the directness of his gaze made performance feel not just futile, but faintly ridiculous. He had listened. Not the way powerful men usually listen, waiting for a pause long enough to insert their own conclusions, but actually, completely, his eyes on me with an attention that felt almost physical. At the end of it, he had said, "You'll attend the morning council meeting tomorrow. Soren will show you where." Not a question, not an explanation. I had wanted to ask why, but the door had already been opening behind me, and the moment had closed like water over a stone. Now I lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the morning council meeting, and what exactly it meant that I had been invited, or summoned, really. The distinction felt important, before any of the other emissaries had even arrived. Morning came with pale, cold light, and the smell of wood smoke, and something baking somewhere deep in the fortress's lower kitchens. I braided my hair, dressed in the least wrinkled of what I'd packed, and found Soren waiting at the end of the corridor, as though she had simply materialized there at the appropriate moment. "You're on time," she said, which I understood to be a form of approval. "You said morning council," I said. I assumed that meant early. "Most of the emissaries," she said, as we moved through a series of corridors I was already trying to memorize, interpret mourning with considerable flexibility. A pause. You're the first to arrive, and the others have been here for 2 days. I absorbed that without comment. The council room was smaller than I expected. A round table, 12 chairs, windows on 2 sides flooding it with the gray morning light. Maps again. Always maps. This place breathed cartography. Several people were already seated. A broad man with a copper-streaked beard who I would learn was Aldrich, the head of the Territorial Council and a beta of considerable experience. A woman near his age named Mira, who administered the Eastern supply lines and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from decades of seeing problems before they became visible to anyone else, and the red-haired young man from the corridor the previous evening, who introduced himself, perhaps too eagerly, as Finn, junior liaison for the Northern Territories. They looked at me with varying degrees of curiosity. Aldrich's was guarded. Mira's was calculating. Finn's was simply open, undisguised, the way young people look at something new before they've learned to pretend indifference. Draven arrived last. The room changed when he entered. Not dramatically. There was no formal announcement, no scraping of chairs. It was subtler than that, the way air pressure shifts before weather. Everyone straightened, not from fear exactly, but from something older and more instinctive. Even I felt it, and I was human enough that the pack instincts shouldn't have touched me the way they did. He took his seat, set a folder of papers on the table without ceremony, and began. The meeting covered 3 things. A trade negotiation with the Southern Territories that had stalled over a disagreement about timber rights. A report on increased rogue activity near the western border. And a proposal from one of the absent pack lords to reroute the Keldmore Road, which would save 2 days of travel time, and also, conveniently, Aldrich said with a dry emphasis, run directly through the absent lord's land. I listened. I did not speak. I was aware that my role was undefined, that my presence here was either a test or an accident, and that the wisest thing was observation before anything else. Then Draven said, without looking up from his papers, Kate, the timber dispute. What do you see? Every face in the room turned toward me. I felt the familiar pressure, the weight of being looked at in a room where I was not supposed to matter. And underneath it, something else, something steadier. I thought of the document I had been handed without explanation, the trunk packed without consultation, the carriage door closing me into a future I hadn't chosen. I thought of arriving at a fortress I didn't know, alone, and answering a king's questions honestly because performance felt ridiculous. I had been invisible my entire life. I had used it, without fully realizing, to see everything. The Southern Territories aren't disputing the timber rights, I said. Not really. They're disputing the precedent. If they concede on the timber, they're acknowledging that Varenhold has the authority to set resource terms unilaterally. That's what they're resisting. The timber is almost incidental. Silence. Aldrich was looking at me with an expression that had shifted from guarded to something more alert. Mira had set down her pen. Finn was visibly trying to remember if he had known this and forgotten it. Draven looked up from his papers. And the resolution? Give them the framing, I said. Not the substance. The framing. Let them co-author the language of the agreement. They'll accept terms they would have rejected if handed down, because they'll have shaped the words themselves. People rarely fight decisions they believe they made. Another silence. Longer. That, said Mira, in a voice that carried the weight of someone who had spent decades being the smartest person in rooms that didn't always notice, is exactly right. Aldrich made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. The sound of a man recalibrating. Draven said nothing. He wrote something in the margin of his document, and the meeting continued. Afterwards, in the corridor outside, Finn fell into step beside me with the unstudied ease of someone who had decided to be friendly and saw no reason to be subtle about it. That was impressive, he said. Aldrich's been circling that dispute for 3 weeks. I just said what seemed obvious, Things that are obvious are often the last things anyone says out loud, Finn said philosophically. He was perhaps 25, with an open, freckled face and the energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed being where he was. How long have you been studying territorial politics? I haven't, I said. I've been reading every document I could find in my father's library since I was 14, because no one ever told me I was allowed in there, and I found that suspicious. Finn laughed, a real laugh, unguarded. I think I'm going to like you, Kate Harwell. I found, unexpectedly, that I didn't mind the idea. The other emissaries arrived that afternoon. There were 4 of them, representing the remaining territories. Castor, from the Westmark pack, large and deliberately intimidating, who looked at me with the particular contempt of someone who has decided what you are before meeting you. A quiet, watchful woman named Petra, from the southern coastal territories, who said almost nothing and missed nothing. Twin brothers from the Highland packs named Rowan and Seth, who finished each other's sentences and treated the entire situation with a cheerful pragmatism that I found immediately likable. And then there was Exiled. Exiled of the Dawnfield territory was everything Seraphine had been prepared to be. Polished, beautiful in an obvious and carefully constructed way, with dark hair and sharper eyes than her practiced smile suggested. She arrived with 3 trunks, a personal attendant, and the kind of confidence that comes not from security, but from a lifetime of being the most visually striking person in every room she entered. She looked at me once, in the main hall where Soren was assigning quarters, a single comprehensive assessment. Then she smiled, the smile that didn't reach those sharp eyes, and turned away to speak to Soren about whether her room had a southern-facing window. I understood immediately that she had decided I was not worth her attention. I also understood from long experience that this was the version of dismissal I preferred. People who ignored you made better observations possible. What I did not expect was what happened at dinner. The evening meal in Varenhold was communal. Long tables in a hall that smelled of wood smoke and roasted game, firelight warm and amber, the easy noise of people who lived and worked together. The emissaries were seated at a table near the head of the room, not at the main table where Dreven sat with Aldrich and Mira and 3 others I didn't yet know, but close enough. Exiled maneuvered herself into the chair with the clearest sightline to the king's table, and spent a good portion of dinner arranging herself to be seen. Castor dominated the conversation. Rowan and Seth ate with dedicated enthusiasm. Petra ate in silence and watched the room. I watched Dreven. He was speaking with Aldrich about something that required both of them to lean over the same document, and he did it without any of the performance I would have expected from a man in his position. No display of authority. No awareness of being observed. He pointed at something on the page, and Aldrich shook his head, and then Dreven said something that made the older man still completely reconsider, and then nod slowly. This was, I thought, what actual power looked like, not the kind that needed witnesses. As though the thought had made some kind of sound, he looked up. Not at the table in general. At me, specifically, with the same direct quality he'd had the night before, the same unnerving lack of social cushion between his attention and its object. I did not look away, partly because looking away felt like conceding something I hadn't decided to concede, and partly because I was genuinely too startled to move. He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back at the document. Beside me, I heard the soft, precise sound of Exiled setting down her cup. She had seen it. From the quality of her silence, she had catalogued it, analyzed it, and filed it under something that would matter later. I picked up my own cup and looked at the fire and told myself it had meant nothing. He was an observant man in a room full of new variables. Of course he had looked around. Of course his gaze had moved. I almost believed it. 3 weeks passed. I measured them not in days, but in the rhythm of Varenhold itself. The early council meetings, the long afternoons in the fortress library, the communal dinners that had begun to feel less foreign and more simply like the shape of evenings here. The cold deepened as the season turned, frost appearing on the courtyard stones each morning and lingering until midday. The forest beyond the walls shifting from dark green to something starker and more honest. I had found my place in the fortress the way water finds its level, not by being assigned one, but by occupying the spaces that others left empty. The library, for instance. It was vast, 3 floors of shelves that curved along the interior wall of the North Tower, accessible by a wrought iron staircase that announced every arrival with a soft, musical complaint. The collection was extraordinary, not decorative, not assembled for the appearance of scholarship, but genuinely used, the spines worn and the margins annotated in that same multiplicity of hands I had noticed on the maps downstairs. Someone in this fortress read seriously and often. Possibly several someones. I began spending my afternoons there after the first week, when I realized that the other emissaries had settled into their own patterns, and none of those patterns particularly required my presence. Castor spent his time with the senior warriors, inserting himself into training sessions with the aggressive sociability of a man who spoke most fluently through physical competition. Isolde had embarked on a careful, strategic cultivation of every person with proximity to Draven, working the inner circle with the patience of a gardener who knows exactly what she is growing. Rowan and Seth had somehow become indispensable to the logistics team, their Highland Pack's practical efficiency making them immediately useful and therefore immediately trusted. Petra disappeared for hours at a time, and no one seemed to question it. Finn found me in the library on the 4th day, as though he had simply followed the most logical path to the most likely location. "I had a feeling," he said, dropping into the chair across from mine with his customary lack of ceremony. "That I would be here, that you would find the one place in this fortress where being quiet looks like industry rather than withdrawal." He looked around at the shelves with genuine appreciation. "I come here too. Though I confess I mostly reread the same 3 histories rather than working through anything new." "Which 3?" he told me. And they were good choices, careful, analytical works, the kind that asked better questions than they answered. I revised my assessment of Finn upward, which was becoming a habit. Over the following weeks, he became the thing I hadn't expected to find here, an actual friend. Not an alliance, not a strategic relationship, not a careful mutual utility. Someone who brought me tea without asking, and argued about territorial history with the comfortable ferocity of someone who trusted that disagreement wasn't the same as rejection. Through Finn, I learned the texture of Varenhold in ways the maps and documents hadn't shown me. The inner guard had a complicated internal hierarchy, based partly on rank and partly on a system of earned trust that had nothing to do with official standing. Aldrich had been Draven's father's most senior advisor, and carried that history in the careful, sometimes mournful way he watched the younger man. Mira had turned down a territorial leadership position twice to remain at Varenhold, which everyone knew and no one discussed. Soren had a son of 9 years, whom she raised within the fortress walls with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone who understood that love and duty were not opposites. And Draven himself. What Finn told me about Draven came in pieces, offered without drama, as though it were simply fact, rather than the thing I found myself most attentive to. "He's been king for 8 years, Finn said one afternoon, the library quiet around us, snow beginning to fall beyond the windows in slow, deliberate curtains. Since he was 26. His father was difficult, that's the diplomatic word. The council still has members who served under the old king, and they bring habits that Draven has spent 8 years trying to correct without dismantling everything at once." "That's a careful way to govern," I said. "It's an exhausting way," Finn said simply. "He carries it well enough that most people don't see the weight, but it's there." I thought about the man who had looked at me across a dinner table with an attention that had no social cushion in it. The man who had asked me about timber rights and listened to the answer as though it might actually matter. The man who wore his authority the way the mountains wore weather. "He's alone," I said, before I had decided to say it. Finn looked at me, not with surprise, with the particular quality of someone recognizing something they already knew, articulated by someone who shouldn't have seen it yet. "Yes," he said quietly. "He is." The incident with Castor happened on a Tuesday. I had been in the lower corridor near the war room, not lingering, simply passing through on my way back from the Eastern Archives, a folder of trade records under my arm that I'd been cross-referencing against the border dispute documentation. Castor was there with 2 of his pack's secondary men, newly arrived from Westmark, and the combination of his natural size, the narrowness of the corridor, and his apparent conviction that I would naturally rearrange my path around his created a situation. He didn't move. I stopped. The arithmetic of the hallway made waiting for him to pass the obvious solution, and I was fully prepared to do so, until he looked at me with the specific expression that some men reserve for women they've decided to find amusing rather than relevant. "The little scholar," he said. Not hostile. Something more condescending than hostile. Tolerant amusement, which has always bothered me more. Still carrying the king's papers for him. "My own research, actually," I said. Research. He seemed to find this charming in an unflattering way. "The Harwell girl does research. Tell me, does it help? Knowing things? In a place like this?" The 2 men behind him had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Not enough to say anything, but enough for me to catalog. "It has so far," I said pleasantly, and moved past him through the gap between his shoulder and the wall, which was narrow but navigable. I heard him laugh, not unkindly, which was almost worse, the laughter of someone who has already decided you're not worth real opposition. I walked to the end of the corridor, turned the corner, and stood still for exactly 10 seconds with my hand pressed flat against the cold stone and my jaw tight. Then I breathed out, deliberately, the way I had taught myself to breathe in my father's house when I needed to remain functional in environments that didn't want me, and walked on. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know until Finn told me that evening, piecing it together from the unhurried gossip of the fortress, was that Soren had been in the parallel corridor, that there was a connecting archway through which sounds carried with architectural clarity, that Soren heard everything, including the quality of my silence before I answered. Soren told no one except Draven, and Draven filed it, apparently, in whatever internal archive he kept of things that mattered. The snow fell in earnest that night, and by morning Varenholt was transformed, softened at its hard edges, the courtyard stones invisible under white, the forest beyond the walls hushed and muffled and immense. The cold was extraordinary, the kind that pressed against every window and made the fires in every room work harder. The morning council was smaller. Aldrich was down with a winter chill that Mira described as aggressively ordinary, and therefore not worth sympathy. Finn had been sent to handle a supply delivery at the lower gate, and 2 of the usual attendees were occupied with weather-related logistics, which meant the meeting was Draven, Mira, Petra, who had apparently been attending council since the 2nd week, her presence having simply solidified through consistent arrival, and me. Draven entered, looked at the reduced table without comment, and sat. He worked through 2 agenda items efficiently, and then he set down his pen and looked at me with the directness I was beginning to understand was simply how he existed in rooms, with no available setting between his full attention and its complete absence. "The Southern Territory framing approach," he said. "I used it. They've agreed to co-draft the language." "That's good," I said. "It worked exactly as you said it would. The logic was straightforward. The logic was available to every person who had been working on that dispute for 3 weeks," he said. "None of them used it." I didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, I had several, and none of them felt appropriate. Mira was looking at her papers with the studied neutrality of someone allowing a conversation its necessary space. Petra was simply watching, the way she always watched, present, unreadable, collecting. "Why are you here, Kate?" Draven asked. The question landed differently than it had the first night, when he had been assessing the substitution. This was something else. not suspicious, not procedural, genuinely curious, in the way that genuine curiosity sounds almost nothing like its imitations. My family sent me in place of my stepsister, I said carefully. I know why the Harwells sent you, he said. I'm asking why you are here, what you want from it. The snow outside shifted in a sudden gust, hissing against the window glass. The fire crackled. Mira turned a page she was not reading. I thought about the library and the corridors, and 3 weeks of learning the texture of a place I had arrived at involuntarily, and found, against all reasonable expectation, that I did not want to leave. I thought about Finn and Soren and the red morning light over the valley. I thought about the meeting where I had said something obvious and been listened to, fully, for perhaps the first time in my adult life. I want to be useful, I said. I want to be somewhere I can be useful. A pause. I don't have a great deal of experience with that, so I may be going about it clumsily. But that's what I want. Draven was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted by something small and almost undetectable. Not softer, exactly, but less armored. You're not going about it clumsily, he said. Mira, very quietly, turned another unread page. And outside, the snow fell and fell, covering everything that had been worn and familiar under something clean and new and entirely uncharted. That evening, Isolde came to find me. She arrived at my door with the smooth intentionality of someone who had planned the visit and wanted it to appear spontaneous. She sat in the chair by my fire with the ease of a woman accustomed to making herself at home, and looked at me with those sharp, careful eyes that her social smile never quite reached. You've made an impression, she said. Not accusatory, observational, though the distinction felt thin. I've tried to be useful, I said. Yes. She tilted her head. That's an interesting strategy, different from what I would have chosen. A pause in which she let that sit. He's spoken about the timber solution to 3 different people, did you know? Aldrich told Mira, who told the head steward. It's made a small ripple. I'm glad it helped. Are you? She looked at me steadily. Kate. We are not enemies. I want to be clear about that. But I also think you should understand what you're moving toward, even if you're moving toward it without meaning to. She leaned forward slightly. Men like Draven don't make space for people unless they intend something by it. And what he intends, that becomes complicated very quickly for everyone involved. She rose, smoothed her dress, and moved toward the door with the unhurried grace of someone who had said exactly what she came to say. I'm not warning you away, she said at the threshold. I'm warning you to be clear with yourself about what you want. That's all. Then she was gone, and I sat alone by the fire. And I was very much not thinking about ice blue eyes and a voice that had said, You're not going about it clumsily, with something underneath the words that I was not yet ready to name. The letter from my father arrived on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks into my time at Varenhold. I recognized the seal before I recognized the handwriting. The Harwell crest pressed into burgundy wax, slightly uneven on the left side the way it always was because my father had never bothered to have the stamp repaired. I sat with the letter in my hands for a long moment before opening it, feeling the weight of the paper, the way you feel the weight of something before you know whether it will hurt. It was brief. My father's letters were always brief, as though emotional economy were a virtue he had perfected through deliberate practice. Seraphine is to be married to young Corvin in the spring. Celeste is pleased. I trust you are acquitting yourself adequately at Varenhold. We have received word from Lord Aldrich that you have made yourself useful in council matters. This is unexpected but welcome. Do not overreach. H. I read it twice. Then I folded it precisely along its original creases, set it on the writing desk, and looked at it for a moment from a careful distance. Unexpected, but welcome. After 23 years, the bar my father had constructed for me was so low that simply being described as useful by someone he respected counted as a letter-worthy accomplishment. I was surprised to find that it hurt less than I would have predicted. Not because the wound wasn't real, but because somewhere in 6 weeks of council meetings and library afternoons and genuine conversations with people who engaged with what I actually said, the wound had begun to be contextualized, placed into proportion against a larger landscape than the one I had grown up inside. I put on my cloak and went to find Soren. She was in the training yard despite the cold, overseeing a rotation of the inner guard with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. Snow had been cleared from the stone, but the air was sharp enough to ache in the lungs, and the guard's breath rose in visible clouds as they moved. I stood at the edge and watched until she acknowledged me with a nod that meant wait. And I waited. When she came to me, her cheeks were flushed with cold, and her expression was the particular open quality it took on when she was between tasks. Not relaxed exactly, but temporarily unguarded in the way of someone who trusts their surroundings. "You look like you received bad news," she said. "Ordinary news," I said. "That's almost the same thing sometimes." She looked at me steadily. Soren communicated a great deal through looking without speaking. She had the economy of expression of someone who had learned early that words were a resource to be spent carefully. "Walk with me," she said. We walked the inner perimeter of the fortress, the cold working at our faces, our boots leaving tracks in the thin remaining snow along the wall's base. She did not ask about the letter directly, and I found myself telling her about it anyway. About my father, about Seraphine and the stable hand, and the arrangement that had deposited me here, about the particular texture of growing up in a house where your presence was an inconvenience that everyone was too polite to name directly. Soren listened the way she did everything, completely, without interruption. "My son's father," she said eventually, when I had finished, "decided when Brennan was 4 months old that fatherhood conflicted with his other priorities. He left on a Tuesday. I went back to work on Wednesday." She said it without bitterness and without the performance of resilience, simply as fact, offered in exchange. People who leave us tell us something important. Not about ourselves, about the limits of their own capacity. I thought about that for the rest of the walk. The crisis arrived without warning on a Friday evening, the way crises generally do, not dramatically, not with the atmospheric preparation that stories usually provide, but quietly, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary dinner. A rider came in through the outer gate at speed. The sound of hooves on stone cut through the hall noise sharply enough that Draven was on his feet before the doors opened, with the instinctive physical readiness of someone whose body processed threat faster than thought. The rider was one of the Western Border Scouts. I knew him by the gray and black uniform rather than by face, and he was covered in road dirt and breathing hard, which told the story before he said a word. The rogue pack that had been testing the western border for weeks had moved. Not a probe this time. A coordinated push across 3 points simultaneously, targeting the small settlement at Greyvale that sat technically within Varenhold's protected territory, but practically at the edge of everyone's attention. Greyvale had perhaps 200 people. The hall reorganized itself with the quiet speed of a community that had drilled for exactly this. Aldrich was at Draven's shoulder before I had fully understood what was happening. Soren was gone from the room entirely, presumably already moving toward the guard quarters. Draven was talking to the rider in a low, rapid voice, his hand on the man's arm in a way that communicated both urgency and steadiness simultaneously. "I hear you. We move now. Breathe." I stayed where I was, and thought as fast as I could. Greyvale. I had read about it 3 days ago, not because it was strategically significant, but because it appeared in a trade document I'd been cross-referencing. A small settlement, primarily agricultural, positioned on the old road that preceded the Keldmore rerouting proposal. The proposal that the absent Packlord had submitted. The one that would run the new road through his own land. Something connected in the back of my mind with the cold, precise click of a lock turning. I crossed the room and positioned myself near Draven's left side, not interrupting, simply present, waiting for the gap in the rapid exchange when he might look up. He looked up. "Kate," The Grey Veil attack, I said, keeping my voice low and even. Check who submitted the Keldmore rerouting proposal. And when. A beat of silence in which he processed this. Then his eyes sharpened with the particular quality of a mind, connecting the same points I had connected, arriving at the same destination 2 seconds behind me, and then past me and further than I had gone. The road that would run through Lorcan's land, he said. Lorcan, the absent pack lord, the convenient proposal, the settlement that sat precisely where attention was least focused. If Grey Veil is disrupted, the old road becomes untenable, I said, which makes the rerouting not just convenient, but necessary, which means Lorcan's land becomes the corridor for all Western trade. Draven turned to Aldrich. Send word to Lorcan that we are aware of his interest in Grey Veil's situation, and that we expect him at Varenhold within the week to discuss it directly. Aldrich's expression shifted through several things rapidly. We don't have proof. We don't need proof to invite him to a conversation, Draven said. The invitation itself is the message. Then he looked at me, with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not assessment. Not the careful attention of a man processing information. Something more direct than that. Something that sat closer to the surface. Come with me, he said. The war room was smaller than the council chamber, more intimate in its purpose, maps on every surface, the table covered in territorial overlays marked with the movements of the past 3 weeks of border activity. Draven spread his hands on the table and looked at the western section, his jaw set, and I stood on the other side and watched him think. Soren was there within minutes, and 2 of the senior guard, and Mira, who had appeared from somewhere without anyone summoning her. Finn arrived slightly after, breathless, with the look of someone who had run. The plan developed in pieces over the next 2 hours, coordinated, rapid, Draven directing it with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly which of his people to trust, with which components. The inner guard would mobilize toward Grey Veil as a visible deterrent. 3 senior pack members would go as mediators to the settlement to ensure the residents knew support was coming. A separate, smaller group would take the less-traveled eastern path and arrive from the direction the rogue pack would not anticipate. I was not a warrior. I was not part of the mobilization plan. I sat at the edge of the table and kept the maps organized as pieces moved and notations were made, which was a small thing, a logistics thing, the kind of invisible work that keeps larger machines running. Halfway through, Draven set down his marker and looked at me across the table. How did you connect it? He asked. Lorcan, the road, the attack, the trade document, I said. Grey Veil appeared in a record from 3 years ago as a waypoint on the old road. I noticed it because the record was from Lorcan's territory originally, and had been refiled under General Western Trade, which was an unusual reorganization. Most filing inconsistencies are mundane. Some aren't. You read trade records from 3 years ago. I read everything in the archive, I said. I don't always know why, until I need it. He was quiet for a moment. The room had its own noise around us. The movement of maps, the low voices of Soren and the guard planning, the fire working against the cold. But within that noise was a smaller quiet, specific to the 2 of us, that had been growing for weeks. Your father's letter came today, he said. I blinked. You know about my father's letter. I know everything that comes through these gates, he said simply. Not with apology. Just fact. He described you as unexpected. In his accounting, that is high praise. Something lodged in my chest like a splinter. Not painful, exactly, but present. I'm aware of how I arrived here, I said carefully. Then you should also be aware, Draven said, that how you arrived has no bearing on what you are. He looked at me with those ice-blue eyes, and there was nothing armored in them at this particular moment, no layer of king between himself and the conversation. What you are is someone this court would have been significantly less equipped without. That is not a diplomatic statement. It is a factual one. The fire crackled. Outside, the first group of the inner guard was already moving through the outer gates, their boots audible on stone even from here. I opened my mouth and closed it again. I don't know what to do with that, I admitted. Quietly. Honestly. The way I answered everything when I was too tired or too moved to be strategic. Neither do I entirely, Draven said, with a candor that surprised me enough that I looked up sharply. He was still looking at me, steady, direct, his hands flat on the map table. But I'm finding that uncertainty is not the same as doubt. The door opened and Aldrich came in with a new report from the border, and the moment folded itself away like a letter along its creases. But it stayed with me all through that long night, as the fortress mobilized and the fires burned high, and Varenhold held itself steady in the dark. Uncertainty is not the same as doubt, held it the way you hold something fragile and real and not yet fully understood. Greyvale held. The inner guard arrived before dawn, visible and deliberate at the settlement's perimeter, and the rogue pack, confronted with the reality of Varenhold's organized response, rather than the undefended target they had anticipated, withdrew before a single direct confrontation occurred. The settlement's 200 residents woke to frost and torchlight, and the particular relief of people who had heard the wolves gathering in the dark, and found, in the morning, that something had stood between them and the sound. Soren sent word back by midday. Draven read it at the council table without expression, set the paper down, and said simply, "Good." Then he moved to the next item on the morning's agenda, with the composure of a man who had learned not to spend relief he might need later. But I saw his shoulders drop slightly when he thought no one was watching. I was always watching. Lorcan arrived 4 days later. He was a compact, silver-haired man in his late 50s with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades making calculated decisions look instinctive. He came with a small retinue and a great deal of surface cordiality, the kind that functions as armor. Every pleasantry a layer of insulation against direct engagement. Draven received him in the council chamber rather than the formal receiving hall, which was itself a message. This was a working conversation, not a ceremonial one. Aldrich was present. Mira was present. I was present, which Lorcan noted with a brief dismissive glance that I recognized as the tactical error of a man who categorized by appearance before usefulness. Draven did not accuse. He laid the documented sequence on the table, the rerouting proposal, the Greyvale trade records, the timing of the border incursion, the filing inconsistency in the Western Archive, and invited Lorcan to explain the coincidences. Lorcan was good. I gave him that. He had a counter-narrative prepared, plausible at the surface, and he delivered it with the smooth confidence of a man who had exited difficult rooms cleanly before. But Draven had the patience of someone who understood that silence was a tool, and he used it with precision, letting Lorcan's explanations extend past their natural stopping points into the territory where elaboration becomes exposure. 15 minutes in, I said quietly. The refiled document was dated 2 weeks before the rerouting proposal was submitted. Lorcan stopped. That means, I continued, the records were reorganized before there was any official reason to redirect attention toward Western trade routes, which suggests the reorganization was preparatory rather than administrative. The room was very still. Lorcan looked at me with an expression that had moved past dismissal into something colder. "Who is this?" "This," said Draven, in a tone I hadn't heard from him before. Quiet, final, carrying something that was not quite anger but was all its weight, is Kate Harwell. She is my advisory counsel for territorial intelligence. A pause, deliberate. Answer her point. Lorcan could not answer her point. He attempted 2 deflections, both of which Aldrich systematically and somewhat gleefully dismantled. By the end of the hour, he had agreed in writing to withdraw the rerouting proposal, to submit his pack's border activities to a monitoring period of 6 months, and to make a direct contribution to Greyvale's infrastructure as a gesture of, the language was careful, regional solidarity. He left Varenhold before dinner. The cordiality had not survived the afternoon. Aldrich, gathering his papers afterward, paused beside me and said, without looking up, "That filing detail." A moment. "I've been in territorial council for 30 years. I would not have caught that." He walked out before I could respond. I understood that was intentional. Advisory Council for Territorial Intelligence. Draven had said it without hesitation, without preamble, as though it were already true and merely needed to be stated aloud. I found him that evening in the library, the one place in Varenhold where I had always felt most myself, and which I was beginning to understand he also visited after long days, when the fortress's demands had been met, and he was simply a man who liked to read. He was at the window with a book he wasn't reading, looking out at the courtyard, where the last of the day's light was going, the color of cold embers. He heard me on the staircase. Of course he did. He heard everything, and did not turn immediately, giving me the small courtesy of arrival on my own terms. "You didn't ask me," I said, "before you said it to Lorcan." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He turned then, leaning against the windowsill, his arms crossed, the posture of a man who has decided to be honest and is settling in for it. "Would you have said no?" I thought about my father's house. The library I had entered without permission, because the prohibition itself was suspicious. 23 years of reading everything I could find, not knowing why until I needed it. The document from 3 years ago, refiled incorrectly. Noticed because I noticed everything and had been given the space, here, to let that noticing matter. "No," I said. "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't ask first. I didn't want you to have the opportunity to talk yourself out of something that is simply true." A pause. "You do that. Talk yourself into smaller spaces than you occupy." The library was warm around us, the fire on the lower level sending heat up through the iron staircase. The smell of old paper and wood smoke that had become, over weeks, the smell of somewhere I belonged. "You do something similar," I said, because honesty had become our working language, and I saw no reason to depart from it now. "You carry the weight of this place as though sharing it would diminish your ability to hold it. It doesn't. It wouldn't." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the courtyard had gone dark, torches lit along the walls, the guard rotation moving in its steady, reliable pattern. "My father," he said, "governed through isolation. It was a kind of control. If no one knew what he was thinking, no one could maneuver against it. It worked, in its way. It also meant he died with no one in that room who genuinely knew him." The words came carefully, chosen with the deliberateness of someone who had held them for a long time and was deciding now to set them down. "I have spent 8 years trying to build something different without entirely knowing how, because I had no model for it." "You have Aldrich," I said, "and Mira, and Soren." "Yes." His eyes found mine across the space between us. "And now I have you." The fire shifted downstairs. The torchlight moved across the courtyard below. I stood in the warm dark of the library and felt the exact moment when something that had been growing slowly for weeks, through council meetings and corridor conversations and the specific quality of being listened to by someone who had no obligation to listen, arrived at its destination and simply was. I crossed the space between us. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about it, which was perhaps the most significant thing. I stopped an arm's length away and looked at him. And he looked back at me. And neither of us felt the need to fill the moment with anything other than what it already contained. He reached up and tucked a loose strand of my pale hair back from my face, very gently, with the careful attention of someone handling something valuable. His thumb stayed at my temple for a moment. "I would like," he said quietly, To stop conducting myself as though what I want has no relevance to how I govern. I believe they are separate questions. They are, I said. Then I want you here, he said, not as emissary, not as counsel. Here, plainly, completely. In the direct way he did everything. I know, I said. I want to be here. Spring came to Varenhold the way it always does in high country. Reluctantly, then all at once. The emissaries departed over the course of 3 weeks in late winter. Castor returned to Westmark with a revised trade agreement and, I noted, a slightly less reflexive dismissiveness than he had arrived with. The Western border crisis had required a kind of collective response that made individual posturing expensive, and he was pragmatic enough to learn from expense. Rowan and Seth left on the same morning they had arrived philosophically. Together, cheerful, already planning their return visit with the logistics team who had adopted them with uncomplicated enthusiasm. Petra departed quietly, as she had existed quietly, leaving behind only a brief written note for me that said, "You see more than you say. Keep doing both. P." I kept the note. Isolde left on a gray morning in early spring, with her 3 trunks and her attendant and her careful, sharp eyes. She came to find me the evening before in the library, our second conversation alone, bookending her time here. She sat across from me and looked at me for a long moment without the social smile, which made her face younger and more genuine. "You didn't maneuver," she said. "I watched you the entire time and you simply were what you are, and it worked better than anything I planned." "I didn't know how to maneuver," I said honestly. "I only know how to pay attention." Something moved across her face. Wry, self-aware, the expression of a woman who is genuinely intelligent and has spent too long using that intelligence on the wrong problems. "Perhaps that's the thing I came here to learn," she said, "even if I learned it from watching someone else." She left the next morning with the grace she had arrived with, and I watched her carriage move through the outer gate from the library window and felt no rivalry, no relief, just a kind of respect for someone who had been honestly who she was the entire time, which was more than most people managed. Finn stayed. This surprised no one who knew him, including Finn himself. He had arrived as junior liaison for the Northern Territories, and had somehow, over the course of a winter, become indispensable to the Council's administrative function, the person who remembered what had been decided 3 meetings ago, who kept the filing system from collapsing under its own complexity, who made sure the right documents reached the right people before the right conversations. He was given a permanent post in early spring, which he accepted with the unceremonious pleasure of someone who has found the exact place they fit and sees no reason to pretend this is surprising. "I'm staying," he told me, as though I hadn't already known for weeks. "I know," I said. "You're staying too. Not a question." "I know," I said again. He grinned. The open, unguarded grin I had come to understand was his genuine face rather than a social one. "Good. This place needs someone who reads 3-year-old trade documents for recreation. It needs someone who argues about territorial history at volume in a library," I said. "That too. My father came to Varenhold once, in late spring. It was not a long visit. He came on the occasion of a formal territorial review, something Draven had instituted as a regular practice, each packlord present in person, rather than represented by document. And he arrived with the composure of a man who had been informed, through official channels, that his daughter held a formal advisory position at the Alpha King's court, and was still processing what that meant in relation to his existing understanding of her. He was shorter than I remembered. That is the strange arithmetic of returning to people you have outgrown. We sat in the council chamber for the formal part of the visit. Afterward, in the corridor, he stopped beside me with the particular uncertainty of a man who has prepared a posture for a situation and found the situation unrecognizable. "You look well," he said finally. "I am well," I said. Genuinely. He looked around at the corridor. The maps, the worn stone, the purposeful movement of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. They value you here. Yes. A pause. Long enough to contain many things neither of us would say, because some distances don't close completely, and that is simply what they are. Good, he said at last. That's good, Kate. It was not an apology. It was not a reckoning. It was a man at the edges of his own capacity for change, offering what he could, which was small, but real. Yes, I said. It is. He left 2 days later. I watched the Harwell carriage move through the outer gate from the same library window where I had watched Isolde leave, and I felt the particular closure of a door that had been standing open for years, finally, gently, settling into its frame. The formal appointment came on a morning in late spring, when the valley below Varenhold had gone green, and the forest had shed its winter severity for something more generous, light moving through the canopy in long, warm shafts. The council chamber was full. Aldrich, Mira, Soren, Finn, the senior guard, the assembled pack representatives. Draven stood at the head of the table and spoke about the winter's events with the quiet, direct authority that was simply how he inhabited any room, and then he spoke about the role of territorial intelligence in the court's function, and then he looked at me, at the other end of the table, with the particular quality of attention that had never been armor, even at the beginning. Kate Harwell, he said, has served this court with a quality of insight and integrity that I intend to formalize as permanent. From today, she holds the position of Chief Advisory Counsel, a role that has not existed in this court before, because the specific capacity she brings to it has not existed here before. Aldrich, who had spent 30 years in this court, and most of the winter revising his initial assessment of me, said, seconded. Unanimously, I believe. Mira made the sound she made when she agreed with something, and found agreeing with it satisfying. Finn was already grinning. Soren, at the wall, inclined her head with the slow, deliberate quality of someone who had known this was coming and approved of how it had arrived. Afterward, when the chamber had emptied, and the morning's business had moved into the corridors and offices and practical concerns of a functioning territory, Draven came to stand beside me at the window, the one that looked over the valley, the one where the morning light came in long and warm and clean. Well, he said. Well, I said. His hand found mine, easy and unhurried, the way things are when they have been true for a long time before being named. I looked out at the valley, green and vast and stretching beyond what I could see, and thought about a gray morning in Ashfield and a carriage door closing and a single trunk, and how none of it had been chosen and all of it had led here. I came here because I was sent away, I said, the unwanted one. And now? He was looking at me, not the valley. I turned to look at him, this man who had asked me hard questions and listened to the answers, and called me his counsel before I had decided to claim it myself. This man who carried his authority like weather, and his loneliness like a room he had been locked in too long, and had finally, quietly, opened the door of. Now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, I said. Outside, the valley held the morning light in its green and open hands. Inside, Varenhold went on, Finn reorganizing the archives with cheerful persistence, Soren running her rotation with her son at her heels on his half-day free, Aldrich arguing with Mira about something they had been arguing about productively for decades, the fortress alive with the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of people who had made a place their own. I had arrived here as a replacement, an inconvenience rerouted, a name on a document that no one had asked about. I stayed as myself, fully, finally, without apology or reduction. And that, at last, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.